So you know the comedian Sarah Silverman? Well, her and several other authors have filed a class action lawsuit against OpenAI and Meta. Now, those tech companies are being accused of using copyrighted information to train their models without consent, compensation, or credit. Now, the lawsuit alleges and points out how these AI models can provide extensive summaries of their information. For example, OpenAI's ChatGPT, when asked to explain the ending of a book that's copyrighted by one of the authors, it can. And the fact that it can actually write out the ending, they're pointing to as evidence that it used it in its training set. But of course, OpenAI has never really explained what their training set is, so they have to, deduce that. So the lawsuit suggests that maybe OpenAI and Meta got this information from a shadow library. Well, yeah, think about your friendly neighborhood library,
but dark web.
Basically an online database that aggregates a bunch of books that people can read without, paying for. Now, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has actually acknowledged in the past that these concerns need to be addressed with a new market mechanism, one that ensures that creators like Silverman can actually thrive and succeed in the world of artificial intelligence. So that got me thinking, what might something like that even look like? Because I haven't heard anybody really address it with a real solution. So here's my guess. We're going to end up in some kind of a world of a pay-to-use AI. But taking some inspiration from how other companies have addressed this in the past, here's a couple thoughts. So I'm imagining that if Sarah Silverman's lawsuit against OpenAI and Meta actually comes through, here's a couple ways that we might end up kind of coming to consensus between the creators and the big companies. One scenario might just be like a straight payout. A company like OpenAI just pays a few $1 billion to some kind of conglomerate group, and then that money is divvied up into the different authors that were used in the training set proportionally to how much it influenced it or how much they've written, something like that. Now, of course, these models are going to want more data in the future, so maybe they just figure out some way to pay for future updates. Now, another potential outcome might look a little bit closer to the way that YouTube, Spotify, and Audible sort of went about this, which was basically, here's the new business model, here's how much money we make, let's negotiate how much of it you deserve as the creator. And each platform kind of ended up with their own negotiations. With YouTube, it kind of depends on if somebody's subscribed to YouTube Red or if they're just actually watching a commercial. For Spotify, it's based on how many plays of a song are actually listened to by the users. And then Audible's still on the straight, pay for ownership, like you bought a book kind of thing. So could it be that the $20 a month that we give to ChatGPT just gets divvied up by all of the information they use to train the model? Maybe. But now there's new models like Orca, which are actually trained on the output of another model. Are you gonna trace the money all the way back through the different models? The other idea is that you use straight RLHF, the reinforcement learning model with human feedback like we're already giving to ChatGPT, but we train it on something akin to, oh, you just gave me back something that's copyrighted, so let me thumbs up that so the model knows what should actually be copyrighted, and it either keeps it out or maybe it charges it. So in this thought experiment, if you asked ChatGPT, give me the ending of the new Avengers movie, and it actually wrote that out, then somehow Disney would actually get some money for the ownership of that. So in this thought experiment, if you said, can you summarize the first 3 books of Harry Potter for me, maybe you would actually pay a little bit that would go all the way to J.K. Rowling and Warner Brothers. Maybe it's a one-time use, or by unlocking it for $1, you can ask questions about the 3 books to infinity, something like that. So maybe the App Store model, 30% goes to OpenAI and then 70% goes back to the original creator. And everybody just lives with the fact that sometimes you can kind of jailbreak your way around it and not actually get paid because people were clever enough to kind of prompt it in a special way. But in the same way that we chase down the Dan jailbreaks now, you just kind of go after them until more and more money flows where it should, according to the copyright. I don't have a good answer for that. I think in Japan, they've sort of settled on the fact that you just lost. If they want to use your data to train, that's just how it is because they don't want to stifle the innovation, and maybe that's where we end up too. But of course, I would feel bad for all the creators that train these models. I just don't know. I don't know what the answer looks like. Let's get to 5,000 subscribers. Smash that subscribe button. Now, do you remember the 2 lawyers last month that were making headlines because they used ChatGPT to generate case law? And in the output, there was references to other case law that was just hallucinated. It was just made up. And then when the judge called them out on it, they admitted that they never looked it up. So it does turn out that we kind of have an ending to this story. They were fined $5,000. And this also acts as a landmark case to represent how ChatGPT can actually be used incorrectly in the court of law. Now, Judge Kevin Castell was going to go a little bit harder on them, but he thinks that they really just learned their lesson and they felt genuinely bad for what they did. And even though he wouldn't say maybe he was influenced influenced a little bit by social media, just like kind of pounding these guys into the ground all day. And I get that society's going through a transition period where people don't always know how large language models work. They don't understand latent spaces. They don't understand the statistical output word by word of something that seems so intelligent. But nevertheless, as the judge pointed out, they're critical gatekeepers of law, and they have to be more serious about checking their references. Which brings me to my next thought, which is what might law and what kind of role would lawyers play in the future if we keep evolving something like ChatGPT? Listen, and I know you guys might start wanting to disagree with me here, but I actually think something like ChatGPT, a large language model, is absolutely essential to the future of law. I think we need to build it into the core. I don't mean that it should replace lawyers at any point until the far, far future, but I would like to see it implemented immediately so we can start moving towards a world where there's kind of two schools of thought of how law should be passed. I have been playing around with the model Claude 2, which is very comparable to ChatGPT, except it has what's called a 100K context window. That means you can dump in like 80 to 100,000 words and ask a question from it, which that could be a lot of law to summarize, to ask questions about, to reference. And I know it's imperfect, but I don't think relying on humans to do that forever is the right answer. Plus, AI is as bad as it's ever going to be. Like, Claude 2, 3, 4, and 5 will eventually come out. The context window will expand potentially to millions of tokens at some point. And in that case, you could actually, in short-term memory, just dump almost all the law that you have about something. But even more than that, we're attaching these things to what's called vector databases. And when that happens, we'll have much more solid, like, retrieval storage, which will make these things even more trustworthy. So my thinking is that the same way a Tesla self-driving car is actually always trying to make a prediction even when it's not turned on, because it's always saying, I think we would do this, and then you turn the wheel even though it's not on, and it's like, oh, that's not what I expected. I better correct my thinking. I would like to see a more text-based version of that implemented in the legal system. Something that should be implemented in the background and for a long time have no implication on what people do or say or any verdicts, but something that's sort of equivalent in the different types of law. You know, in some cases, maybe it transcribes what's said verbally in a courtroom. You know, it scans in or reads through OCR like documents that are actually submitted. It takes guesses as how documents should be formatted. And then when they're actually submitted, it compares the two. It makes guesses as to how judges will rule, and when it's wrong, it uses that as a correction signal. Whenever a certain document is requested, it actually generates that and then looks at what was really suggested and thinks about that as another error signal. You know, and follow that system down into the weeds, get it involved with all sorts of different types of law, like on different levels of court and all that stuff. You know, and I think that should just basically be like a big government project, like the same way we have like our streets and sewer systems. And then maybe when the time is right, putting no limit on it, you could start to show the output when it's at a really high accuracy to people so that the humans can then compare what they're doing to see if there's something they could be doing better. Like in the same way that chess players should still play other humans, but sometimes they sit down with these superhuman AI chess playing machines to become better at what they do. And then as a final step, maybe in some cases where it's either a third world country or somebody who doesn't have the resources to like do any of this, maybe you could let a system like this kind of step in if people wanted it. Smash that subscribe button. But you know, of course, the big companies are thinking about this also. Google's DeepMind, OpenAI, and several academic institutions have published a new paper suggesting what new international institutions might look like for governing AI. And the TLDR is that they came up with 4 different institutional models. The first would be called the Commission on Frontiers of AI, and their job would be to simply build a consensus on both AI opportunities and AI risks. And it wouldn't be opinion, it would try to build that consensus using the scientific method. The next would be called an Advanced AI Governance Organization, and it would set international standards, support implementation, and potentially monitor compliance. Frontier AI Collaborative, an institution that would develop and distribute cutting-edge artificial intelligence models, making sure they're spread globally around the world in a more equal way. And then an AI Safety Institution, which would be focused on scaling up technical research about safety, international safety, standards, compliance, all that stuff. And you know what? It's a step in the right direction. Kudos to those guys for putting out the paper. So now let's check in with the Adobe Firefly drama, because they've been trying to do everything by the books. They're kind of leaders in not getting sued, I guess you would say, with these models. So Adobe AI has an AI image generating platform called Firefly, and it has generated significant buzz, and they have also reported a quarterly earnings that makes people think that they're on the right track. Now, Adobe's in a unique spot because Adobe Firefly was actually trained on Adobe stock images, hundreds of millions of the photos that they actually have rights to use. And with like the Sarah Silverman lawsuit going into OpenAI and Meta, people just are like, oh, let's put our money in Adobe because they might have, a better shot at like keeping their core tool. Now, obviously, a lot of the creators that make Adobe stock images are kind of miffed about it, but Adobe says they're going to address that at some point and try to get some money back into the creators' pockets. Are they? I don't know. How much? Who knows? Is it going to be a lot? Probably not. But the fact is, Adobe thought ahead because legal experts point to how the terms of service were originally written. And needless to say, it was very broad language that actually probably is going to cover most of these use cases. There's also a bunch of confusion about who should actually be regulating deepfakes on the government side. So as the use of deepfakes is starting to proliferate, especially in terms of campaign, politics, elections, all that stuff, the government's not even quite sure on who should be regulating it. They're also struggling to interpret a bunch of campaign laws that were written well before this was considered. But now we live in a world where there's hyper-realistic audio, visual content, false statements, misinformation, the whole shebang. So Public Citizen is this nonprofit organization, and they've petitioned for the Federal Election Commission to regulate deepfakes. But whether the FEC is actually going to do that or not is kind of up for debate now because they have 6 people who voted on it and it's a 3-3 deadlock. So Public Citizen's initial effort is now kind of in limbo until another court picks it up. And the deadlock is increasing pressure on the more higher levels of government to actually step in and say what everybody should be doing. And there's this notable example that Ron DeSantis put out there of Donald Trump hugging Fauci, which may be real or it might be a deepfake, we're not really sure. Which would be the kind of thing that the FEC would actually weigh in on if they thought that that's what they're supposed to be doing. But it gets more tricky because the FEC is traditionally about campaign finance laws, so they would do the accuracy of political advertising, but this is a little bit different. And there's also a concern that having the government try to police all this stuff is kind of infringing on the First Law Amendment for freedom of speech, and that like maybe we're supposed to let deepfakes go crazy and it's up to the citizens to decide what's real, which doesn't really make sense, but also having the government decide all that stuff doesn't make sense. So that's where we're at. Let's talk about microdirectives and how AI could revolutionize legal compliance. This concept of microdirectives in terms of artificial intelligence was kind of a new word, a new way of thinking for me, but then when it clicked, it kind of clicked, In a legal sense, it's when you combine artificial intelligence with legal decision making. Now, the example that made sense to me was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DCMA, and how you might get an automatic takedown notice when you upload something to a social network. And that's pretty much an automatic process. That's like pattern matching, being like, oh, we've seen this copyright thing, this person is uploading it. It could also be a system that's trained on a whole bunch of spammy looking things and you upload something that really has a high probability of fitting that same kind of mold, so they're just like, But now as it gets applied to kind of bigger things like cameras that watch people in convenience store and decide when somebody's shoplifting and automatically say, that's shoplifting, that's kind of like, ooh, are we ready to be like that level of DCMA? But now this concept of a micro-directive is kind of being expanded. So it's something like a camera that might be watching people in a convenience store and it's got a high probability of somebody stealing something, like putting it in their pocket, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, should we take instant legal action? And I'm sure just like getting a takedown request on YouTube, you could probably like appeal it or something like that. So some human would probably review the footage, make sure that really is somebody who's trying to steal something. But it brings up a lot of legal questions, and some legal scholars are pointing to this whole micro directives idea as something that needs a little bit more framework around it. We need to get more clear on where and when it can be used. But if used correctly, that could really help with surveillance and making sure people feel safe without making sure their like rights are infringed on. So we might see a future where the word micro directives, artificial intelligence, and law start to combine in a new way. I'd like to share an opinion piece with you from a writer named Connor McMurtry. And he wrote about how there should be no artificial intelligence regulation at all. And I was like, let's explore it. It's an interesting thought. And he points out notable figures like Max Tegmark, Elon Musk, and Jeffrey Hinton are overly influenced by the risk to humanity. I know, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So basically that everybody's going off a flawed assumption because the one outcome where humanity is destroyed is kind of like overwhelming our logic. And he points to 4 ways that we're thinking incorrectly about the probabilistic future. Now the first is comparing the nascent state of current AI to the early days of social media, pointing out how the industry is not fully formed and it's too early to regulate it. Second, he warns about regulatory capture and corporate favorism, which might just end up giving too much to the big companies and make it too hard for the smaller companies to compete. So the intention to regulate us to safety just becomes big AI gatekeepers. The third argument centers around the concept of plausible equals inevitability fallacy, which is a phrase that's a little over my head, but I think it means the tendency tendency to assume that if a scenario is plausible, that it's also likely, right? That's just like Bayesian thinking, just like, oh, that seems like it would fit, without actually thinking about the prior. And fourth, he points out how there's not a present need to regulate anything. There's no serious incidents that have been caused by AI, so why don't we just wait until something happens and then we can use that information to help craft our regulations. My next goal for YouTube subscriber count is to get to 5,000 subscribers. If you want to smash that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it.